Happy Mother's Day again. Moms, I've got some good news for you. And then I think this is sort of summarizes being a parent and especially being a mom. I've got some good news for you, but I've got some bad news for you too, okay? The good news is that in 2016 there was this study conducted. I don't know how much money or effort was put into the study because I could have conducted this study in the nursery down the hallway at Wallula, all right? The study concluded that your child is uniquely geared. They are engineered. Their mind is wired in such a way that they especially recognize their mother's voice. If you just hang out or serve in the nursery or the preschool and you see mom walk up to check one of those little ones out, you know that they are uniquely engineered to recognize their mother's voice. And the good news, I suppose, is that this study concluded that the older the kid gets, the more they recognize their mother's voice, the more it resonates with them. In fact, the results were so clear that scientists could determine the age of the child based on the brain activity and the MRI as they studied those results when that kid heard his or her mother's voice. They're uniquely geared to hear their mother's voice. That's a good news, I think. The bad news is that they're uniquely geared and engineered. Their mind is wired in such a way to hear their mother's voice until it isn't. A recent study by the Stanford Medical School concluded that sometime in the teenage years, that teenagers, they're wired to tune out those voices most familiar to them. That they start to pay more and more attention to the novel, to the new voices surrounding them. That it's all a part, they say, of a natural maturation process. That we want our kids to become independent. And so there's a point when the mind clicks and they start to hear novel voices more than they hear their mother's voice even. So, if you've ever been a parent of a teenager's mom, and you maybe walk down the hallway one day and you have that event coming up, the graduation party or the Thanksgiving or whatever birthday party, and you walk down the hallway to teenage son's room and you look in and you can tell that a teenage boy lives there, and you say, oh man, you have to clean this room up. We have, the guests coming, and we just put it together, so clean up this room. And then you're busy, you're a mom, so you're busy, and you go on your way. You come back in a couple hours and you walk past that room and you look in and you realize that it's in at least the same condition that it was a couple hours prior. Maybe it's worse by now. And you say, son, didn't you hear me? I asked you to clean this room. And that teenager's response is, I didn't hear that. I don't know. The bad news is he literally has a note from the doctor. All right, he maybe didn't hear what you were trying to say. There's a point when that mind is geared to hear other voices more than yours. You'll hear parents say, and this is true, I shouldn't wave it off, this is true. Parents will say something like, to be a parent is the most fulfilling, it's the most meaningful, it's the biggest, most important job I'll ever have in my life, and I wouldn't trade it in for anything. It's full of blessings and purpose and fulfillment. And we would be lying, though, if you are a parent or have been. You would think, man, it's also full of so many challenges. It's the most meaningful, sure. It's the most fulfilling, absolutely. But it's also the hardest job that you'll ever have. And it's full of challenge after challenge after challenge. We've been walking through the book of Acts, and one of the things we've seen the birth of the early church and how it's taken off, and we've seen the leaders of that church perform miracles, and people come to hear about Jesus, and they stick around by the thousands to be a part of this new movement, to be a part of this new team, to be a part of this new family. And so far we've seen so many great things happen in and through the church, God's family, His team. And it is so fulfilling. It's so meaningful. The mission is so important. It will make a difference in your life, in this lifetime, and for all of eternity. Absolutely. But as followers of Christ, we would be lying if we didn't also include that a life following after Jesus, being a part of His team, being a part of His family, being a part of His church, to be on mission with Him, is full of challenges as well. Sometimes they're just challenges that life throws at us regardless of who or what we are following or doing or whatever. But sometimes those challenges are directly linked. They're tied in to following Jesus. In Acts chapter 5, verses 17 through 42, we read about at least one of those challenges that the apostles, that the early church faced, tied directly to following Jesus. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to open them up to Acts chapter 5. We're going to take a look at a story that begins around verse 17. We're going to consider 4 responses that we need to think through, that we need to consider as we also face challenges tied either directly or indirectly to following Jesus in this life. I wish I knew exactly how much time had transpired. We don't know. In the book of Acts, there are a few different occasions that we can date, and we can kind of re-engineer all the dates in Acts. And so you can look up and Google a timeline in the book of Acts, and you'll find some different thoughts and answers. But the truth is, we don't really know how much time has transpired between, the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost and this challenge that the apostles encounter in Acts chapter 5. We're not sure if it's been weeks or months or even a year or more between Acts chapter 3, when Peter and John first encountered that 40-year-old man who had never walked, healed him, and initially gotten in trouble with the Sanhedrin, with these religious leaders. And I wish I knew exactly how much time it was. However much time it was, though, it was enough for those same religious leaders, for that same high priest and those same Sadducees, the same Sanhedrin, to sort of have their jealousy and anger overflow. Because those apostles, they were back at it. They were in the temple again. They were preaching. And not just the apostles. It wasn't just Peter and John. It was all the apostles together. At least that's the indication here in Acts chapter 5. And it wasn't just those 12 apostles, but thousands and thousands of people gathered to hear the story of Jesus and to worship together. They had heard the story of Peter and John healing that 40-year-old man. In fact, people were bringing their loved ones from all around the countryside to the temple to get just close enough to the apostles, they thought. They thought maybe if we could just have our loved ones, lie in Peter's shadow to come across them, that would be close enough for them to be healed. That would be close enough for the power of Jesus to work in and through them. And so thousands of people were gathered, and the Sanhedrin had simply had enough. They were tired of telling these apostles to zip it, to keep it quiet about Jesus, and to have those apostles come back to the temple and continue to preach about Jesus again. And so they send for the apostles to be arrested. And they send the captain of the temple and his guard. They go arrest Peter and John and the rest of the apostles, and they throw them in jail for the night to sort of stew overnight. Kind of like that teenage son that you send to, go to your room and think about this. That's essentially what's going on with the apostles here. They're sent away overnight in the public jail to think about what they have done. Sometime in the middle of the night, though, something miraculous happens. An angel shows up, and the angel opens the prison doors, and he lets the apostles free, and they are scurrying out of that jail as quickly as they can when the angel gives them some instructions. And the angel said, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go back to the temple, the place where you were just arrested. And I want you to share the words of life with all the people. I want you to go back, in other words, to the place where you were arrested, and I want you to start preaching about Jesus crucified, buried, and raised from the dead again. Go back to the place where you were arrested and go back to doing what it was that you were doing that got you arrested in the first place. And while this is an amazing scene, an angel unlocking those prison doors, while this is absolutely miraculous, to me the bigger miracle is that these apostles, they do just that. At daybreak, as soon as there's a little light in the sky, these guys are back in the temple preaching Jesus crucified, buried, and raised from the dead. It brings us to response number one here in our story. And response number one is uncompromising obedience. Isn't that how these apostles reacted? Let's jump into the story here in Acts chapter 5 at verses 20 and 21. We're just picking it up where the angel is giving instructions to the apostles. And the angel said in verse 20, "Go and stand in the temple and speak to the people all the words of this life." And when they heard this, they entered the temple at daybreak and began to teach. And these two verses, as I considered this uncompromising obedience of the apostles, I just underlined a few phrases in these couple of verses. And the first phrase I underlined is speak to the people all the words of life. Speak to the people all the words of life. Because this is a big deal. I want you to go back and I want you to preach the same thing that got you arrested. What had gotten them arrested? Well, it's this method of preaching, this story that's told over and over in the New Testament. New Testament scholars call it the kerygma, and it's simply addressing a specific situation and then teaching the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. They're back doing that. These words of life that offer life. It's such a big deal. There are things in life that I think are nice ideas. Like, it's been beautiful outside the last few days, hasn't it? Have you gone for a walk or spent some time in the park or even walked from, maybe your place of employment to the car across the parking lot? And as you're making your way across the parking lot, it's 71 degrees, it's beautiful, sunny afternoon, and you're thinking, what have I been doing inside? Why haven't I been outside all day? What is the deal with this work and job and stuff? It's just so beautiful. And you can be fooled. I'm fooled every spring on these 70-degree days, and I think, Sherry, what we need to do is, this summer, we need to go camping. We need to find a spot next to a lake, maybe a bubbling brook somewhere, and we need to put up a tent, and we need to spend a few days just in the nature and God's glorious creation. And I in my mind, I just picture this, and I think, oh, what a time that would be. We need to do this. And then somewhere along the way, I think, when we go camping, I bet you it won't be 71 degrees. I bet it'll be 105. And that babbling brook will be just this nesting ground for these mosquitoes the size of bears. And then I think about all the stuff that I'm going to have to load and pack and get ready to go on this adventure, to enjoy creation. And I start thinking, oh, I've got air conditioning at home. And this idea is nice. Like, it'd be really cool. And I would probably be a better person if I took the initiative and I got out and we actually did that. But nobody can be mad at me. I don't think. For deciding, that's a nice idea, but I can take it or leave it. Maybe next summer I'll do that. Well, here the angel tells these apostles, I want you to go and I want you to share these words that are life. Last week we kind of started down this road, right? To follow Jesus, it's not a take it or leave it kind of thing. It's not an idea that is a nice idea, but nobody can be mad at you if you say no. It's life or death. There are eternal consequences. And that's the message. That's the story that these apostles were told to go share. That's the story that they were sharing. This life or death decision. And man, they went. This amazing, uncompromising obedience. I just get to verse 21 and I just underlined the word daybreak. And here it is again. We've talked recently. I've told you before that God has been bothering me about this fourth watch of the night thing, and I keep asking them, just leave me alone about it, right? The 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. God, just leave that to me, all right? I've got important things, sleep that I need to do. I need to have that handled. Just quit bugging me about it. But over and over, so I'm sorry that you've heard this again, but he keeps bugging me and I'm just passing along, okay? Here it is again, a daybreak. I preached about this a while ago. I mentioned the fourth watch of the night in that time period, and one of my friends, Stormy, caught me after service, and he said, yeah, in the military, you have to be focused around that time because that's when the enemy attacks. And it's not that I don't trust Storm or anything, but I thought, I'm going to look this up. Can we verify this? And so, famous battles, right? The Battle of Lexington and Concord. First shot fired, 5 in the morning. 5 in the morning. The Battle of Bull Run, you've read about this. You'll remember that. Maybe that phrase kind of rings a bell from the Civil War. It was a terrible battle. Bloody awful. First shot, 5:30 in the morning. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, those boats blew off course, 6:30 in the morning. 6:30 in the morning. Pearl Harbor, that's a little later. Those planes flew into attack at 7:38 in the a.m. in Hawaii, but I figure that's Hawaii time, so it's about the same, right? And we have to be aware this battle goes on. This fourth watch of the night, and there's, I thought about those battles, and I can't speak to this, right? I'm not a person who has experienced this, and I can't speak to this. But the amazing thing to me, it's easy for a guy like me, I guess, to say, oh, the first shot was fired at such and such a time. But following that first shot, there were soldiers and sailors and airmen who followed orders, who obeyed orders and marched into harm's way. It was a big deal. It was such a big deal that they followed and they went into battle with this uncompromising obedience. Look, I'm not the guy to say this, I suppose, but this eternal question of following Jesus, an even bigger choice, an even bigger decision. It matters more than any one of those famous battles in history, any one of those wars won in history. And it requires the same kind of uncompromising obedience that was followed by these apostles, who went back to that place, who went back to doing the very activity that compromised them in the first place, that got them arrested in the first place. I think about this uncompromising obedience. Last week, we told you that our friend Dave Coleman is heading to Honduras this summer to work in full-time ministry and missions, and I've been teasing Dave that I'm excited that he's leaving. And I tell him, I'm excited that you're leaving because it frees up 17 positions, 17 opportunities for other people to serve at Wallula. You know, there are all these open assignments now where we need folks to jump on board with uncompromising obedience as Dave is giving in with uncompromising obedience. It's like a domino. It just falls, right? You know, this last Board of Ministries meeting, we introduced Jason Alvis. He's stepping in as our missions team leader, a position that Dave held for many years and served faithfully, uncompromising obedience. I think about all the opportunities with the leaders here at Wallula, or maybe it's filling one of those baby bottles that are on the table out there. God, you could figure this out, and you could give a little bit to help the women's the women's shelter, and you could serve like this. And so go ahead and take one of those bottles. Just take it away with uncompromising obedience. Or maybe it's bringing some Twinkies or cookies or whatever to help with VBS. There's this whole table with stuff that they need to carry out VBS, and you can carry away and bring that back. And or maybe it's serving that week of VBS. 80 kids already signed up to participate in VBS. That means we're going to be way over 100. I think last year there were nearly 200 kids at Vacation Bible School throughout the week. And so Katie still needs folks to serve during that week. And I promise you that as you are working as the hands and feet of Jesus, that you're going to make a difference in the life of a kid and a family that week, and maybe a bigger way than you can imagine if you just follow through with some uncompromising obedience. Maybe it's finally inviting that neighbor to worship that you know you needed to talk to, or it's putting an end to that conversation at work that you know shouldn't be going on and you shouldn't be standing around listening to, and you just need to say, hey, cut it out. Uncompromising obedience. Probably it's something God has been working on in your heart and mind, on you for a long time that I know nothing about, that you just need to say yes with some uncompromising obedience. So the high priest, he calls the Sanhedrin together, and they had the apostles arrested. They put them in jail overnight. They get together the next morning, and they're ready to meet. And so he sends some guards off to pick up the captives, to pick up the apostles from jail. And these guards go off, and I know this isn't true, but I like to think of these guards as the same guards that were at the tomb, or maybe the cousins of the guards who were at the tomb, and they go and they're like, oh, not again. So they go back to the jail, and they have a chat with the guards standing outside the cells, and then they open the prison doors, the cells, and they look inside, and they are just frozen. Their eyes get really big. It's like when you walk to the freezer and all night you've been thinking, I'm going to have that last bite of ice cream, and you walk to the freezer and you open the freezer door, and somebody else has taken it before, and you look underneath the frozen peas and the frozen broccoli, and you're just indignant that you have peas and broccoli but no ice cream in the freezer, and it's not going to be there. It can't hide under those peas, but you lift that bag up like 3 times just to double check. That's what's going on with these guards. They're looking into the cell, into the corner, and there's nothing to lift up. There's no other corner to look in, but they keep checking because already they're thinking, what are we going to tell our boss? What do we tell the high priest? We lost another one. What are we going to do? And so they go back, and they're standing before the high priest and the whole Sanhedrin, ready to spill their guts. But before they can get their story that they have contrived out, somebody else runs in. And without permission, this person, out of breath, just gasping for air, says, do you guys know where those people you had arrested are? And the high priest said, well, they're supposed to be here. We're supposed to be bringing them right now. And they said, no, they're not here. They're not in prison. They're back in the temple, and they're telling that same story about that same Jesus guy. The high priest is flabbergasted. He doesn't know what to do. He sends the captain of the temple with some soldiers. He said, bring those guys in here. They invite the apostles. Scripture's pretty clear. They can't arrest them again because there's thousands of people all around again. They're not sure what's going to happen. They invite them back to have a conversation. The apostles show up, and the high priest looks at these guys, and he said, haven't we had this conversation before? We asked you guys to stop teaching and preaching Jesus. You got to cut it out. And Peter looks at the high priest, and one more time he says, look, if we have to decide whether to obey men or God, we will obey God. And it was a great answer. But then Peter, he's Peter, so he just keeps going. And he starts preaching about Jesus. And he said, you know, this Jesus who you crucified, who you killed on a cross, who you buried, he raised from the dead. God raised him from the dead. Not only did he raise him from the dead on that third day, he's exalted him to his right hand. And the Sanhedrin, the high priest, and all the other religious leaders, they've had it. How would you expect them to react? Well, you would expect them to react exactly how they react in verse 33. When they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. But then again, this miracle happens because this Pharisee stands up as he sees the anger of those leaders. And this Pharisee stands up, who's the Pharisee of all Pharisees. He's a well-respected guy. And he stands up and he said, look, we've been through this before. We've had these uprisings. And when we've gotten rid of the leader, what happened to those other followers? Well, they scattered and they were never heard of again. Not once, but twice, and probably more than that. And he said, if that's true of this uprising, look, we got rid of their leader. Surely they'll scatter, and eventually it'll just burn out. But if this movement, he said, is of God, and you get in the way, you might not only find yourself on the wrong side of history, you'll find yourself opposing God. Brings us to response number 2. Remember, God protects in extraordinary ways. Look way back at verse 19. It's the first way God protects. He sends this angel, right? But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out. And then he said, go and share this life-changing, life-giving story of Jesus. And so this angel of the Lord, that phrase is used 11 times in the New Testament, mostly at the very beginning of the Gospels and the Christmas story. That happens quite a bit. It's used over 50 times in the Old Testament. And most often in the Old Testament, when that phrase, angel of the Lord, is used, it's almost like an extension of Yahweh himself. So when this angel shows up, it's a really big deal, because God is present. My daughter Zoe, she just finished her second year at K-State and Manhattan Christian College. This year she had a preaching class at MCC. It was a big deal because there were 3 people in this preaching class. And so she had to preach to, 3 people, the professor and 2 others in this class. And she preached her first sermon, and I sent her a text, and I said, send me a video of the sermon. Do you have video of it? I want to watch. I want to hear this. And for a long time she said no. No, I'm not doing that. No, Dad, leave me alone. Dad, quit stalking me. Dad, like that. And finally, she sent me a video, and I watched it, and she did a great job. And I'm watching, and I noticed that as she preached this sermon in her little class there, and I noticed that she was preaching without shoes on. And I'm watching this, and I start to cry because she's preaching without shoes on. It's ridiculous. But I don't even know if Zoe knows this, but a long time ago when I was young and dumb, I would occasionally preach without shoes on. And when somebody asked, I would say, well, I expect for us to meet God here. Right? Moses at the burning bush, what does God tell him to do? Take your sandals off, right? This is holy ground. All right, I'm not sure if I expect to meet God here. I don't think it requires us to take our shoes off necessarily, but that, in my young mind, helped me remember that. And I thought, oh, is that why I don't, is that why he's always doing? It's a big deal. We expect to meet God. This uncompromising obedience, this idea that God meets us in big ways still today. It's not even the most amazing way that God protected the apostles, though. You get to verses 34 to 39, but a Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in honor by all the people, stood up and gave orders to put the men outside for a little while. And he said to them, "Men of Israel, take care what you are about to do with these men. For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it'll fail. But if it's of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God." So they took his advice. They listened to this Pharisee. And here's what's interesting. This Pharisee, he was a big deal. He was well respected. He was an important rabbi. In fact, this particular Pharisee was the mentor of this guy we'll soon be introduced to in the book of Acts, Saul, who, when Jesus gets his hands on him, changes his name to Paul. And what was Saul doing when Jesus got his hands on him? He was off rounding up Christians, arresting them, maybe even to have them executed. This is the school of thought that this Pharisee was behind, promoting. And yet he stands up and he says, "Take a breath." Because of wisdom? Okay, sure. But from this side of the cross and from my little space on this stage, I think because of God. Because he uses this guy kind of outside of his normal train of thought and character, perhaps even, to protect those apostles. And you know what? God is still doing stuff like that today. We had this board of ministries meeting, and I heard a story about one of our small groups. This small group was started by Karen, and Karen started this small group in her home, and this small group got started, I think, and I hope I'm not overstepping, but Karen had some health issues. She couldn't drive for quite a while. So she starts, "Hey, we'll have this small group come to my house because I can't drive. So we'll have this small group at my house." And so these 10 women start coming to this small group, and she told me that it represents, she told everybody at this meeting, that it represents 5 different churches and this small group of 10 women. And one of these women shared with her that she said she calls almost every week to thank her for this small group, because before she didn't have, when somebody asked, "Who are your friends?" she didn't have many boxes to check there. And now she does. This small group that comes about because of something the leader didn't want to have happen in her life. Because of this challenge, this hurdle that she faced. God uses this hurdle. God uses this challenge to make a difference in the lives of those 10 women, and in this one woman in particular who feels isolated and alone, to have relationships that are meaningful and matter. And oh, by the way, they're receiving these words that are words of life. God is still doing extraordinary things through everyday experiences. Through sometimes he's protecting us in extraordinary ways through things that we'd rather not go through. So they listened to the Pharisee. And they let the apostles go. But before they let the apostles go, they have them beaten, 39 lashes, and then they release them. And the apostles, they leave. And the apostles, I'm not sure if physically they could leave jumping and leaping like that 40-year-old man who Peter and John healed, but they leave, Scripture says, rejoicing. Can you imagine? They're rearrested, more or less. They're beaten 39 times, and then they leave rejoicing. It brings us to response number 3, to choose joy in all circumstances. Look at verses 40 and 41. And when they had called the apostles, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. What is it in the mindset of these apostles that allows them to practice joy in the midst of this hardship? That Saul guy who's going to be renamed Paul by Jesus, he ends up writing like 2/3 of the New Testament. One part of that New Testament is the letter, the book that we call Philippians. And Philippians, you read through the short book, it's all about joy. And in these few chapters, it mentions the word joy or rejoice or some form of the word joy 16 times. Nearly as many times, Paul mentions in that book the word mind. There's like this connection. There's this connection between the renewing of our mind and practicing joy in our life, no matter the circumstances. How were the apostles able to do it? How did they have that right, proper mindset? Let's walk back and let's see what we know about them so far in the book of Acts. One of the things we know about these apostles is that early church, these apostles, they built this foundation of that team, that early church on prayer. You go through every chapter or thereabouts in the book of Acts and you can read a prayer in Acts chapter 1 and Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 20, 21, 22, and 28. You can read about or read an actual prayer from the church, the leadership, asking about who should step into this position of leadership, praying for boldness, we've already read, praying for missions and teams to plant churches, praying to be released from prison, praying for those who have gone ahead of them, praying for the churches that they've already started. Over and over and over, they are praying, they're building this team, the church, on a foundation of prayer. And oh, by the way, they've been indwelled by the Holy Spirit. So they are relying on this relationship with God through prayer and through the gift of the Spirit, and then on relationships with other believers. They're not going about this mission alone, but they're on mission, they're on purpose, they're moving ahead with others around them. And it's that mindset, those ingredients to a mindset that allow us to choose joy in all circumstances. You would think after all this that maybe those apostles would, take a day off. That they would just get out of town for a weekend and just catch their breath. But that's not the mission they're on. That's not who these guys are. That's not the uncompromising obedience that they are about. It brings us to response number 4, to stick with him. Look at verse 42. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus, that Jesus is Lord, He is Messiah, and they just keep it up. I underlined in verse 42, every day. You don't have to do like this in-depth word study in the Greek to figure out what the word every day means. Those words mean every day. Over and over and over. They keep showing up. And where do they show up? In the temple, and then house to house. What Luke could have said is that every day and everywhere these guys went, they kept sharing the story of Jesus. They stayed close to Him. And over and over and over, they kept sharing Jesus. They stayed on mission with Him. Because members of God's family overcome the challenges of life with Him. It's Mother's Day. And if you haven't gotten a Mother's Day card yet, it's probably too late. But if you haven't and you're looking for one, I have some Mother's Day cards that honestly I can't suggest. All right, in fact, I would recommend not giving these Mother's Day cards. The first one says this: Mom, I love you loads. There's a picture of a laundry basket that says, speaking of loads, can you do my laundry? Right? Don't give that to your mom on Mother's Day. The next one says, Mom, thanks for always checking up on me. There's a cell phone with, 24 missed calls from Mom. Not respond to your mother's text messages, all right? And this next one says, I'm awesome. You're welcome. Happy Mother's Day to the luckiest mom ever. Some of you sent this card already. I'm not going to name names. This is the next one. Mom, no matter how hard life gets, at least you don't have ugly children, right? I mean, that might be true, but, do something else. This last card reminded me of this guy, Nick Gonzalez, used to be on staff here, and he would always talk about punching people in the throat. I think he's relatively harmless, but he would always I'm going to punch them in the throat. And I'm like, no, whatever. Anyway, this card says, thanks for being my mom. If I had a different mom, I would punch her in the face and go find you. All right? Don't send, and even if you have to wait for a table at lunch, don't punch somebody else's mom. All right? Just be patient. All right? These cards, don't send these Mother's Day cards. But the thing I've discovered about moms, I guess about my mom in particular, but I think all moms, is that even when you do something stupid, right, you think, oh, this is going to be hilarious. And for Mother's Day, I'll give her a card with a picture of a laundry basket and say, I love you loads. Will you do my load of laundry? When you do something that dumb, that moms, they tend to stick with you, right? They tend to stay close. They tend to love you no matter what. Even if that hasn't been your experience, know that this morning we worship a Lord and Savior Jesus who absolutely sticks with us. Oh, by the way, even when we do stupid things, even when we're not only practicing uncompromising obedience, even when we're running in the other direction, He loves us and He sticks with us and He's just calling us home. And know that if you are facing a challenge, maybe it's just something life's throwing at you, or maybe it's tied directly to being a follower of Jesus, know that you can overcome those challenges of life because He's sticking with you. Let's stand and worship Him right now.